Hi, welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. I forgot what I was doing there. There you go. Sort of a little blonde moment from me. I'm Noel, and this is the Wellbeing Show, which I've been doing for years. How could I forget that? I've got a great guest with us from across the pond, Nicole, who's going to introduce us to a subject later that is new, relatively new to me, actually. I've not come across it much, which is post-adoptive depression. And I think many of us may have heard of postpartum depression, but not necessarily post-adoptive depression, although it's making sense to me and I can imagine it now thinking about it, because we tend to think of postpartum depression as only about the sort of hormonal biological thing, and there may well be some of that going on, but I guess it's the change in life as well, because it's quite a significant thing. So we're going to be hearing about a subject that I'm really interested in learning about, and I hope the guests are. Welcome, Nicole. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's genuinely my pleasure. Like I say, it's a sort of relatively new topic to me, so I'm interested in learning about it. You're over in Florida at the moment?
I am in the Tampa area, so sweltering here in Florida.
Yeah, I was telling you before the show started, when I first went to Florida, I remember the moment the door opened and we all suddenly started melting.
Right.
With
Yes.
the heat and the humidity, all the Brits just went, what on earth is this?
Yeah, we get 9 beautiful months a year and then 3 pretty hot ones.
Yeah, I'm sure. How long will this sort of heat go on for now then?
Probably till mid-September or so. It's definitely early this year. It doesn't usually kick in till later in June.
Global warming is everywhere, right? Uh,
Yeah, yep.
yeah, quite. So have you always been from, is Florida your sort of home state, as it were? It's Sample.
No, I've been here over 20 years now, though, raised my family here and so on. But my husband and I are originally from the New York and New Jersey area.
Okay, so further north from where you are.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
So what was it like in New York? Did you grow up around Manhattan or the broader?
Yeah, yeah. I grew up right outside New York City, so that was, fun and exciting, but a little too cold for me. Didn't like the ice and the snow.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think I realized it at the time, but in hindsight, after living down here for a while, I just prefer kind of the more relaxed pace here, a little too frenetic up there.
Yeah, New York is really in your face, isn't it? So,
Yes, yeah, exactly.
did you grow up in sort of a large family or it was just you?
So I have two older sisters. So I'm the youngest. My parents are both immigrants from the Netherlands. So we were first generation, me and my sister's first generation Americans.
Yeah.
So yeah, we had
Whereabouts did your folks come from then?
from the Netherlands, they're both from the Netherlands. My mom is from Hilversum, and then my dad is from Venlo, right on the border with
Oh,
Germany.
yeah. So that's quite a significant shift. I can imagine they sort of felt more comfortable in New York. I can understand why they would. If they'd gone to Florida, they'd have found it quite shocking, I think.
Right. Yeah, probably so. They did actually end up retiring to Florida.
Right.
And there was quite a large German community here that they kind of connected with. But
Right.
yeah, spent most of their adult lives in the New York area.
And was it a big community for you that you were in, a sort of supportive immigrant community, or where you were sort of,
No, no, not at all.
yeah,
And, my parents very much wanted for us to grow up as sort of American as possible. They stopped speaking Dutch at home, which is still a sore point for me that I did not grow up speaking Dutch. Um, and yeah, they just wanted us to totally assimilate as much as possible. So it's kind of as we all got older and appreciated that background more that,
right.
kind of learned about it and felt more of a connection
Yeah.
to that culture than as a child.
It's interesting because one thinks of America, maybe not currently, but certainly historically, as a
Right.
place where people held on to cultural identity quite strongly.
Yeah, I think it's, just different for different communities. And my parents both had really tough experiences during the war.
Right.
So they just wanted to kind of leave and put that behind and move
Sure.
forward.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I know some traumatized communities from World War II wanted to leave that identity behind.
Yes.
And there was a thing that parents often did in that time where they didn't want to talk about those things at
Yeah.
all.
Yes.
But it was present. We know psychologically it was present anyway. So is
Right.
that the type of sort of dynamic that was going on for you? That
Yeah, absolutely. And my dad especially, they were both involved, but his father was actually very active in the resistance. And at some point, they took my father and his mother and his siblings all into a concentration camp to try to get my grandfather to surrender. So very interesting family story. But my father would never speak about it. When we were back over there for my mother's father's funeral, he took us to the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam, and that was
okay?
the only day of my life that he spoke about it to us. So we've tried, he's passed away, since we've tried to get my mom to document as much of it
Right.
as possible because it's so tragic to have that lost to history. Um, but some of it has been, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting while we're on the subject, if you don't mind talking about it,
Yeah.
because I guess you and I both know, don't we, that trauma is an inheritable condition.
Mhm.
And sort of people don't want to talk about things, but actually they still pass it on.
Right.
And their children experience it. It's passed on in behavioral cues, but also it's passed on sort of biologically as well. Um,
Right.
and and so you and your sister, we can only talk about yourself, may have had some quite strange experiences growing up that you couldn't quite put your finger on. Why am I?
Right. Yeah, yeah, I think so for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of people from that generation were thinking that they were protecting their kids. But the kids, your generation, have had to go and do their own journey. I had a nurse on from New York, of all places, not so long ago, who's had to make a journey back to Ireland to try and
Okay.
understand something because of her grandmother's experience. She located from Ireland to America. And just last week, I had a surgeon on who was from the South in America, and
Mhm.
his father had been a survivor of the camps. He was in the
Oh,
Jewish
wow.
community and had survived the camps and never
Wow.
spoken about this stuff. Uh,
Mhm.
and and there seems to be a thing, and we know from the research about inherited trauma about this need to find out what happened. Is that
Yes,
something you identify with as an experience?
it is. And, like I said, we do have some documentation from it. So, for instance, right at the end of the war, the Dutch government really encouraged everyone to actually document their experiences and stories and memories. So
Yeah,
my grandmother, who was in the concentration camp with my father and her other children, did we actually have a whole document that she wrote detailing that whole experience. So that has been wonderful to have, and really helpful. I wish my dad had spoken about it more, but I can't. I certainly don't judge him for that at all.
mm,
That was how he needed to process all of that. But yeah, I mean, I've tried to go back and get more information from his siblings and from other governments and so on that he like received medals from and so on. And it's been difficult, a lot of brick walls, and that's been frustrating because I would love to have all of that
yeah,
information.
yeah. And I would sort of also echo what you just said about your father. There's no intention by anybody to suggest he did anything wrong.
Right,
They just didn't even have the language in those times,
right,
the words to explain this stuff. You know,
right, exactly.
we've learned the words now, but how could he have known it? I mean,
Right, right,
it's
right,
impossible to ask that task. But
exactly.
I guess I'm raising subject so that people currently can understand the importance of communicating things uh,
Yes, yes,
when you've got
absolutely.
the language. One thing that's also intriguing me and striking me because the whole sort of notion of adoption, which is where you work, there's themes of adoption seem to exist in your life. You've got this country that's adopted you, the culture that's adopted you, American culture, if that's not too sort of blunt a way of saying it. Um,
Right, right.
but that seems to be, but then there's also often there can be, because the law, certainly in the UK, around adoption and identity of original parents has changed quite a lot. At one point, if you're adopted, you would have no chance of finding out who your birth parents were. These days, it's
Right.
very carefully recorded, simply because we know the longing to know from that adopted child is very strong. I'm presuming it's similar in the US.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So like a generation ago, there was no information, extremely difficult to find. And now it's continuing to change and continuing to become, easier and easier for the adopted children to have those connections. But still in many states, not as easy as it could be. So that's something that is continuing to evolve.
But also, it seems to me something of a parallel process in your own life about trying to figure out
Mhm.
this backstory of your parents and the culture that you carry,
Right.
that needs somehow to be recorded because it's an important part of who you are.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, it was just striking me as I was listening to you, thinking that's interesting. So your childhood, I guess, was happy and normal. You went to school,
Yep.
you had your sister, your parents were loving, they worked hard
Yes.
like all immigrants do. Uh,
Yep.
that's the immigrant story. I guess they were successful, they were okay, they had good jobs and all that sort of stuff, and you grew up
Yep.
with what you
They
needed.
kind of lived the American dream.
Right, exactly. That's why it's there because there's enough evidence it can work for some people. And then
Right.
you went to school. That was okay. You what was sort of your interest, if you like, growing up? Were you the all-American girl, the cheerleader, or were you the academic?
I was not a cheerleader.
Right.
I was more of an academic minded person. Went to college. After that, went into um, computers and business consulting and all of that, and just that I I liked the way the logic of it worked, but just the whole work environment, company situation wasn't for me. So I went back to grad school at that point, got a business degree, and focused on entrepreneurship because I always felt that at some point, I would want to have my own business, but I wasn't sure sort of what it would be.
Okay.
And so I went to work in marketing, which I enjoyed a lot more. And then when the opportunity kind of presented itself to shift into this adoption world, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, I kind of leapt at that and actually, my marketing experience and a lot of the consulting experience and so on plays into it more than you might think, on a regular basis. But so that's kind of how that path all came together. Um,
Okay.
kind of finding what I didn't want up front and then having the opportunity where it pulled together, everything that I did want.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting that you go from the business computer to adoption and and then I go, well, how did that happen? That's interesting that you moved.
Right. Right.
Well, how did that happen? What was the sort of emotional process for you of making that decision?
Well, one of the things, when I was working after grad school, and like I said, I was enjoying that field much more, but I just felt like I wasn't making a difference in the world,
Right.
and that became more and more important to me. And then, especially when my husband and I started trying to have a family, and we went through a lot of struggles with that and a lot of
Okay.
infertility. But ultimately, just having children, becoming a family, brought that even into more sharp focus in terms of just wanting to have an impact, make a difference, not wanting to spend a lot of time away from my children for something that I felt wasn't that important, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of, I think, where it really shifted.
I mean, fair enough. I don't know that many people who love the corporate world. They survive it. I think
Right,
they survive
right,
the corporate world, but there are very few that I know who celebrate it. It's large, anonymous
right,
organizations,
right,
that
exactly.
there are extrinsic reasons why you would do it. But I guess what you're suggesting is that because you had to work so hard to have your own family, there was something in there that sort of made you want to then think, well, I want to do more than be anonymous in an organization and make mega bucks for an organization.
Right, right, exactly, exactly. And I started kind of trying to address that need through volunteer work, which was great and very rewarding and satisfying. But again, it was adding to, now I was working full time and volunteering, and that was taking more time, away from my family. And then through the volunteer work, I started just, and my personal experience, learning more and more about, kind of the whole infertility world, and realizing what options, were out there, and that people weren't as educated as they could be about it, and that I could help with that. So that's kind of, like I said, when it all sort of came together.
And interestingly as well, because, and again, I'm just making this up sort of from listening to you. This isn't a therapy session, but it's interesting for me that certainly your parents and certainly your father and your grandparents were involved in social action, making the world a better place.
Right.
And they were
Right.
highly damaged for it. They
Mhm.
had awful consequences as a result of it.
Yes.
But they were that type of person that they saw injustice and wrongness and they wanted to challenge it and do something about it. And they paid a dreadful price for it. My heart goes out to them. And actually, we wouldn't be here now without the sacrifice that people like that made, right? So
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
absolutely owe them a debt of gratitude for putting themselves on the line. Was that somehow communicated in your family, this idea of wanting to do good in the world, or had your parents moved away from that, do you think?
It wasn't, pushed as a lesson per se, but I always felt, at least, very much aware of it. And when we would talk about it, again, more with my mom, my dad wouldn't really talk about it, but I would ask a lot in terms of, there was a lot of risk that they were taking. Especially my father's father, knowing that his children and wife were in a concentration camp. They took a lot of risk for that, and so I would ask some questions about that. And apparently, what he always said, like his life motto, was just, what's right is right. That's what you do, no matter what the consequences, or the price. So that's, and certainly he lived that, much more importantly than I do, I would say. But that's something that I've always kept in my head, and tried to keep in mind, and tried to live by, whenever possible, that it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. That's
Yeah.
when you're looking for the answer, that's the answer.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Also, I think that the area where historically your family come from is much more community oriented as well. I mean, it is very
Mhm.
much about community. It's about creating. If you go there now, my friends have just come back from a holiday over there for a weekend, and they were struck by how safe it feels. And it's very
Right.
family oriented. It's very child oriented. It's very nurturing, safe spaces, and it was at that time as well, until the war happened, of course.
Right.
But
Right.
there were those strong bonds and connections between people, that people were involved in community and being decent human beings. And I
Right. Right.
guess you were given that culture as well by your parents.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So you have these difficulties conceiving, you have challenges to have children, but you have your children. How many did you have in the end?
So two children, a girl and then a boy. So yeah, so my husband and I went through, just a lot, a lot of it, a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of
Yeah.
heartache, as most people do who end up going down that path. So yeah, so we ended up having our children via egg donor. Um, and obviously I don't regret that for one moment. Like, it just was the most amazing thing, and from an incredibly generous person. But part of why we went that path is because we believed a lot of, like, these myths and horror stories and things that you hear about adoption. So we didn't really consider that in the way that we could have. So as I learned more about that, through my volunteer work, I was like, oh my gosh, like, this is a good option that people should at least know about. It should be something that's on the table when they're considering, their different options.
Okay.
So that's kind of how that came together and led me down a path, slightly different than what I personally went through.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. I would say, and I guess you're going to agree with this, that we need more options, not fewer options. And so
Right.
all options need to be on the table and people need to make informed choices. But certainly adoption, um, there seems to be two dominant images. One is of this sort of, you're going to get this perfect child from some country overseas
Right, right.
that comes as a blank screen with nothing involved with them. And then the other option is you're going to get, a terrorist from the child protection system. Right.
Right. Well, we even throw it up
But
here.
there
I don't
seems to
know
be
how
everything
it,
else in between, really.
right, right. Um, so I don't know how it works over there, but here and what I specialize in is actually neither international nor through the Child Protective Services.
Right.
It's private domestic adoption, which is when the adoptive parents kind of match with an expectant mom during the course of her pregnancy,
Okay.
and then the baby is placed with them, immediately after the birth.
Okay. So tell me about that. It's really, really interesting because I don't think there's a similar process here in the UK. There may well be, but I think the laws around certainly in vitro, egg donation, these types of things are quite different in the US to the UK.
Yes, yeah. Right. So with our child services,
Yeah.
that's through our foster care system, and that's generally when, you know, babies or children are removed, from the parents' home because they are deemed to be unfit parents for one reason or other. Um, so with what I work with the private domestic adoption is that it's a woman who's had a crisis pregnancy or unplanned pregnancy or for whatever reason um, doesn't feel capable of raising the child, and she may not want to terminate the pregnancy or certainly have the child put into foster care. Maybe she doesn't have family who is interested, willing, and able, to care for the child as well. So she chooses that she's going to make an adoption plan.
Okay.
And then there are far more families who are looking to adopt than there are women
Yeah,
who are looking to
always.
place their child for adoption. So they're signed up, with agencies, and they kind of create a whole profile. It's kind of like a scrapbook. There can be video, that sort of thing, just describing their life, what the child's life would be like with them, and so on. And then from those, the expectant mom or the birth mom actually chooses the family who she wants to raise her child, and then they're matched, like I said, usually during the course of the pregnancy, so they kind of get to know each other a bit, text messages, phone calls, some visits, that kind of thing, throughout the pregnancy. And then after the birth, every state is slightly different, but usually like right around when she's leaving the hospital, which is usually like a couple of days after the birth, that's when the birth mom can actually sign the legal documents,
Okay.
and for the adoption to take place.
And it's a transfer of what we would call parental responsibility, which is the
Right, right.
legal right to
Transfer
make
of custody.
decisions for
Yep,
that. Right.
yep, exactly.
And then that's the legal bit done. Does the birth mother, the genetic mother, have any continuing involvement or rights at that point?
Um, so the legal part isn't officially done usually till several months later, but for all intents and purposes, it's done at that time. It has to work its way through the court system and so on.
Sure.
So once it's all done and finalized, the birth mom doesn't have legal rights in terms of contact or certainly decision making or anything like that. But usually these days, the adoptive parents and the birth parents or the birth mom have come to an agreement, about what that's going to look like in terms of what kind of communication they might have. Sometimes it's none. That's becoming more and more rare. Often it's, text messages, sending pictures, updates. Sometimes it includes phone calls and visits. And then over time, that often evolves, just like every relationship in
Yeah.
our lives. It can evolve to be less contact over time, but more often it evolves to become more and more contact over time. And people often get to a point where they're like, we already consider each other extended family, and
Sure.
everybody's respecting the boundaries, and isn't this strange that she doesn't know our last name or that we don't get together in person? And so it kind of changes over time.
Right. So it's flexible in terms of how the relationship might sort of evolve. It would be negotiable, if you like.
Right, exactly. So in almost all states, the agreement that has been created up front is not legally enforceable. It's more of just a moral and ethical commitment.
Okay.
And then yeah, and just kind of often just see where things go.
Yeah, so it's not a formal contact agreement.
You're
It's
right. No.
a relationship. Okay, I get it.
Right.
And then people are just reasonable and they put the best interest of the child first, and
Yes, ideally.
as reasonable people do, right?
Right.
So that explains it. I mean, the system may well exist in the UK. It's been a long time since I've worked directly in social services around like that, so I don't really know if that's available. But
Mhm.
it'd be interesting if people are listening in the UK and they know that it is available. Please let me know, and I can make sure that we put links to organisations underneath the show as well, because it sounds like a really great meeting. And I presume it's open to, is there a vetting of the potential adoptive parents and stuff like that? One of the things about adopting
Right.
in the social services model is
Right.
that there's a very long on-ramp. Sort of,
Right. Right. Yeah. So there is, but it's not to the same extent or depth as it is through social services, because the birth mom is getting to make the choice, right? But the families do have to pass what is called here a home study, and they do background checks to make sure that they're not on child abuse registries or things like that.
yeah,
They have their home visited to make sure that it's a safe environment for a child. They have to prove medical reports to show that they have, they're expected to live long enough to raise the child, financial information to show that they can afford to raise the child. So things like that. And then they get an approval. But that process,
interesting.
takes
It's
a few
interesting. What I'm
months, maybe.
thinking about, there is a sort of more informal system in the UK called private fostering arrangements. Um,
Okay.
that's usually not pre-birth agreement, though. It's usually post-birth agreement. But it
Okay.
is possible to hand over PR to people, but on a chosen basis. So it's really interesting. I think it's a fantastic service, to be honest, to have that available. Um,
Yeah, yeah. And that process, at least for the home study, often just takes like a few months. So it's not like
right.
through the foster care system, which takes a lot longer to get approved through. Yeah.
It also suggests to me, I don't know, there might be figures for this or not, I don't know, but it suggests to me that it's stopping a lot of children ending up in the care system, who might otherwise end up in a unstable home. Um,
Right, right. So
breaks
that's the
down.
idea for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So a really, really interesting model. Thank you. I'm really interested in it. So that you got involved in that. How did you hear about that? Because you were volunteering in the field.
Yeah, exactly. So I got very involved with, we have a National Infertility Association. It's a nonprofit organization called Resolve. It might be worldwide now
Yeah.
at this point. But so, yeah, so I got very involved with that organization and just doing volunteer work and that sort of thing. So that's where I started, learning more and more about it. And I met another woman who was kind of doing the sort of work that I'm doing now. And I started doing volunteer work specifically for her, and just kind of, because the whole adoption world sort of fascinated me. So I learned so much more about it. And then the opportunity, we were living in Atlanta, Georgia at the time. The opportunity arose for us to move here. So that seemed like a great opportunity then to kind of go out on my own with that, instead of right in the backyard of, of the woman who I'd been learning it all from, right? That didn't seem right. So when we moved, I was like, okay, great. I can bring these services down here,
Right.
that she's offering up there. So it was just sort of the right time.
Beautiful. So everything comes together in a sense, your
Right, right.
entrepreneurial interests, your business interests, and your desire to help the community. Sort of what a beautiful, perfect storm to be involved in.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, great. And so you set up this current agency that you've got. And then tell me about when you began to notice the post-adoption depression. Had it been something that was already known about and you began to see it, or was it something you noticed yourself?
It wasn't something I noticed myself because, the work that I do, so I'm actually not an agency, like I don't place the babies. I tell people I'm like a wedding planner for adoption. So I guide people through the process because it is a very complicated process here. Um,
So a
so
bunny or
once
a coach through it.
Right, right. So once they've adopted, I don't have a lot of ongoing contact with my clients.
Yeah.
There are certainly some exceptions to that, but generally not. But it was more from, again, just being such a part of that whole world. I was doing a lot of speaking at conferences where there were people speaking on all other, related topics. And I think that's where I started hearing about it from people who were speaking at those conferences. And I realized, this is something that people who are going into adoption just need to be aware of. Same, with
Sure.
postpartum depression, you need to be aware of it so you're not taken by surprise. Because, when people kind of start pursuing adoption, usually they've been through infertility treatments, they've been struggling with this for years. They're so just focused on, I just want to have a baby, right? I just want to have a baby, I just want to be a parent, that it's really hard to kind of think beyond that. And what if what if I'm feeling this way or that way, and how might I address those situations? Their mind is not there yet. But it's so important to be aware of it. So if it does happen to them, they're not surprised. They can recognize what's happening. They can get the support that they need. So it's something I just started talking a little bit more about in my work, just so, again, people would know about it,
That's
if and
great.
when
Oh,
the situation
that's
arose.
really great. Really important service to highlight these issues. So,
Right.
is post-adoption depression exactly the same as postpartum depression, or are there differences?
There are definitely differences. I mean, obviously, with postpartum depression, it's probably a little bit more biological and hormonal, but I'm no doctor, but I'm sure there are also biological and hormonal changes, when you become a parent through adoption. That, I don't think that would surprise anybody. Um, the similar life changes, the similar things that you are giving up in your life for certainly what you're getting, but there are losses. But on top of that, I think it's really different for adoptive parents for a couple of reasons. One is that they've worked so hard for this. They've invested so much time and money and emotion. This is what they wanted, that I feel like they feel like they're not allowed to not absolutely love every moment, right? Something's really wrong with them if they're feeling sad about, achieving this goal that they've tried so hard for. And I think the people around them feel that way a little bit too, or they at least worry that the people around them might feel that way. So maybe they're not reaching out for support, or maybe not receiving that support. And then there are other additional stressors. Going through infertility treatment, going through adoption is very expensive here. So
Yeah.
you've got financial stressors. You don't get the same leave from work if you haven't actually given birth. So now you're dealing with that.
Wow.
Um,
Absolutely. Yes, I hadn't thought of that at all. Yes.
right.
Yeah.
You're dealing with relationships with the birth family. You're worried about how that's going to be. You have unknowns about the child's in utero experience. So all of those things are sort of piled on top of becoming a parent, right? So it's just such an overwhelming and stressful time.
So there's a lot of stuff that potentially can get in the way of that necessary bonding moments in the early sort of months,
Right.
right?
Right. And then people worry that adds to it, right? Oh, am I letting this get away in the way of the bonding? And then that's like a whole other stress on top of it. Right.
And will people experience depressive symptoms such as loss of motivation,
Yes.
distorted thinking, problems in concentrating, problems in sleeping, etc., etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very similar symptoms.
And then getting even to the more extreme version of thinking of harming themselves and that there's something really wrong with them, right?
Yeah, I mean that can happen. Fortunately, that's pretty rare, but it,
Yeah.
it can happen.
Okay. Okay. So if people had a sort of list of depressive symptoms available, that list would look pretty much the same, but maybe slightly more extreme, I guess, in post-adoption depression, because there's been just suddenly your life is changing, isn't it? I mean, I know
Right.
it happens after birth, but at least you have that 9 months of growing, right?
Right.
When you've been adapting anyway. But suddenly I imagine that the baby comes home with you and boom, you know,
Right. Right. And sometimes, sometimes you're matched with the expectant mom throughout the pregnancy. So you have some of that
yeah,
adjustment time and preparation time and so on. And that is usually the case, but not always. Sometimes it's last minute. You get a call from the adoption agency and you hop in the car and you go, so you haven't had any of that preparation time,
Right.
I mean, you've been thinking about it obviously for a long time, but in terms of logistically and, maybe you're haven't really talked about it at work and that plan's not in place. And, so those are, again, just all those additional stressors by not having the 9 months to kind of figure out what the plan's going to be and how it's going to look. All right.
And the key word, it seems to me, is stressors.
Mhm.
So knowing something about the biology of it, the key hormones that we want are the opposite of stress hormones. So there's a need in terms of the capacity to bond. What we need
Right.
are the opposite of stress hormones, and we need space and time in which to sit, essentially do very little, but just be available to slowly
Right.
develop a relationship, and particularly with a newborn who doesn't really have any capacity to form a relationship. They just don't. But like,
Right.
particularly for the first 6 months, and if people aren't educated about that, they can misinterpret what's going on. But
Right.
but the newborns often are very confused about what's going on and can
Right, right.
blame
And
them,
and yet
right?
I'm not a doctor in this area, but
Yeah.
I would imagine, the newborn has in utero been hearing certain voices and that kind of
Okay.
thing. And now it's all different. So that's, might have some impact there as well with the
Yeah.
baby.
Yeah, they're quite resilient, but I think new parents can become overly anxious about these things.
Mhm. Oh,
Um,
for sure. Yeah.
and get really worried if things are perfect. And there's, I don't know what you think about this, but I think there's a lot of pressure on parents today to be amazing parents in the
Yes.
way that my parents were not amazing parents. In fact, they were the opposite of amazing. And we see all those jokes, don't we, on Gen X, on TikTok and
Right.
stuff like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
We had the garden
Absolutely.
hose, never a tap. That's the truth.
Right. Right, absolutely. I don't know. There's one that goes around. I don't know if you had it over there, but when I was a child, there was literally a thing that would come on the TV at the end of the news, and it would say, "It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?"
Yes, quite.
Like parents actually had to be reminded, like to know where your children were.
Well, literally, I remember me and my brother during the summer school holidays, we were given some sandwiches and something to drink in the morning. We were kicked out the house and not
Right,
expected to come back until the evening when we would be,
right,
you know.
right.
Actually, what was going on then was that in our local community, all the parents were doing the same with the kids, and they all knew the kids. And so they were
Right.
all just sticking their head out the window and make sure the kids
Exactly, exactly.
were. It was, but that those structures don't exist. And I think there's a lot of pressure now on parents. You know the saying, it takes a village to raise a child.
Mhm.
Do you know that saying? And I think
Yes,
that
yes.
that village used to exist, but it doesn't exist for modern parents. So I think there's a lot of pressure on the nuclear family in
Yeah,
particular.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And to, I mean, yes, knowledge is power, but with all the research and so much more information is available these days, it's like, oh, okay, I'm, supposed to do exactly this, and their, mobile in the rim is supposed to be black and white, for this brain development. And oh, I got a color one. Like, what have I done?
Yes.
All of those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, and even to the choice of things like clothes and it's people are buying new clothes for infants. I'm like, why would you do that? I never had anything.
Right.
It was always handed down. So
Right.
I think a lot of unnecessary pressures. And also in America, one imagines, not so much in the UK, but stranger danger has become a big thing, even though you and I both know the figures on it. It's not a
Right.
real risk, you know.
Right. Right.
In terms of risk to children, it's the same as it's always been, people that they know, to be honest.
Right. Right.
That's why we have
Yes.
vetting procedures. But I guess it's sort of the fear and fantasy of that. I suppose the message to get across to people is, depression, anxiety, about major significant life changes, and folks having a baby, whether you give birth to it or you adopt it, is a major life change.
Yeah.
Probably the
Absolutely.
most major life change you're
Yes.
ever going
Yes.
to have. To have complicated, difficult feelings about that would seem to be normal to me.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, again, just pairing it with all of the unknowns and the worries and all of that. It's just,
But
it's
also, is there something as well about like maybe adoptive parents are setting themselves up a little bit because they have such expectations. They've worked so hard.
Yes. Yeah, they don't feel that they are allowed to, have moments of questioning or of doubt or of not enjoying the moment, right? Of being frustrated, of wanting a break, from the baby for an hour. Like they just feel like they're not allowed to feel those things because this is what they've put so much effort into achieving.
It's interesting because I've come across it not so much about adoptive parents, but I've certainly come across it about parents who've had children through IVF, for example. And I'm not suggesting it's you, because I know you've been through IVF, but
Right.
the overinvestment in the child,
Mhm.
because it's been so hard to get to
Yes.
that point, is a dynamic that needs to be factored in, I think.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think that there have been some studies, and generally people who've been through IVF, tend to be older and more mature because it's taken them a while, and they tend to be more financially stable because they have to be able to afford IVF. So there are all those factors that are hard to kind of suss out, but there are studies that show that those parents are more involved parents, but in a positive way, not like in
Good.
the helicoptery way and so on. But
Yeah.
I feel like that's something that a lot of people take pride in, and I'm not saying it's not rightly so, but it almost helps to justify some of that. Oh, well, we've been through all of this, so the studies show that we're going to be better parents, and that's well and good. But I think that again creates more pressure than instead of actually relieving it.
Yeah, and just as a light touch on this topic, because it's not a light topic. Let's have some light on. It looks like it's going to start raining. It's only sort of early evening. I don't know why it's getting so dark. Um, but uh, the idea of cross-cultural adoption, the idea of adopting not just color, but there's other cultural issues and maybe lesbian families and gay families, etc. Do you have any thoughts around those types of issues?
Yeah, and especially if you are talking about transracial adoption
Yeah,
specifically, because it is so visible to
yeah,
everyone else around. Um, and that's always been a topic of lots of conversation and lots of different points of view. The reality here in the US is that most people who are looking to adopt are Caucasian families, and there are plenty of children of color who are being placed for adoption. So a lot of people say and think, well, those children would be best off in a family of the same color. But the reality is there aren't as many of those adoptive families out there. So many of those children are going to be raised in a Caucasian family or in a different culture. And historically, a lot of the thinking was, that being colorblind was the right approach, right? And love is enough, and you don't need to address it, and you just love the child for who they are, and that's that. Now we know better, that you have to see their color, and you have to honor their color and honor their heritage, and show it in your home, have artwork, watch TV
yeah,
shows, have books, make sure you live in a diverse enough environment. If you attend religious services, go to a place where there's diverse people where they can find peers and racial mirrors. So there's a lot of effort that goes into it, but it all benefits the child, in a wonderful way. So it's
yeah,
really important for people these days who are looking at transracial adoption to understand that that's what it's going to take to do right by the child, and
yeah.
be willing to do that.
And the benefits to the child, but also, I guess, benefits to the parents as well.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for
As
sure.
you
For
know, I
sure.
think diversity benefits us all, to be honest, in the end.
Mhm.
Particularly these days, we need more voices that are crossing those divides.
Yeah, for sure.
You know
Yep.
what I mean? That's sort of like I have great hope in the children. Look, Nicole, we have to finish, unfortunately. I told you we would run out of time really quickly and not to worry about the amount of time. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you on the show. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you. I've
Thank you. I
been
have enjoyed chatting
incredibly
with you as
informed.
well.
Yeah, really fantastic service that you're giving, and I love the fact that that for me the story here is this: you come from many generations of people making the world a better place, and some of them have really put their own lives on the line, and you
Right.
continue in that honourable tradition. And I've got a feeling your grandparents would be very proud of you.
Oh, thank you. It's
I
very
really do
sweet.
think they would. So she's a chip off the old block, isn't
Yeah, I would like to think so.
Oh, without a doubt. I think they're smiling at you from somewhere, going, well done. Really lovely to have you on. How do people learn more about you? Have you got a website?
Yeah, so my website is theadoptionconsultancy.com.
Right.
And I also host a podcast, which is on adopting.com. And it is called Adopting the Podcast. So that's for people who are considering adoption kind of early in the stages, not really sure how to go about it. So it's a lot of sort of early on education about various topics. So those are the two best ways to find me.
And what I would say to people listening, if you feel that you have depression, postpartum depression, post-adoption depression, your first port of call, if you're worried about yourself or somebody else, would get hold of your family doctor, your general practitioner, and talk to them about it. Because they should be in the US. Would that be similar advice, or would you send them somewhere else?
Um, a lot of the practitioners here, I think, don't know about it and might not know how to handle that. So certainly, it can't hurt to reach out to your OB because they probably dealt with postpartum depression. But
Yeah.
I would also reach out to adoption specific entities. So here in the U.S., we have Resolve is the National Infertility Association. They would be able to point people in the right direction as well.
Um, Before the show goes in, what I'll do is I'll do a quick bit of research about whether they exist in the UK and or if there's another organization. I'll make sure those links go out with this show, plus the links to your company. Um,
Great.
it should be wonderful to have you on. You stay there. We do have to finish there for today. Thank you for coming and spending time with us and sharing time with us. Folks, I hope you found that really as instructive as I have, to be honest, sort of opening up a whole new area. It makes absolute sense to me. As you were talking about, I went, yes, of course, it exists, doesn't it? Because it's such a major
Right.
transition, of course. It must do. And it's really important that you're raising the issue and helping new parents normalize these experiences. Really lovely. You stay there. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody for now in the UK. Do send me messages on WhatsApp if you have any questions, and I can forward them to Nicole as well, which is 07506 319 745. See you all again at the next show. You stay there for now, Nicole. Bye bye, everybody.